Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CSPI podcast. I'm here with Charles Lehman and Gabe Rossman. A lot of you will be familiar with them. Charles, can you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, my name is Charles Fain Lehman. I'm a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor at City Journal. At Manhattan, I sort of work primarily on a diversity of issues surrounding public safety, but I'm also very interested in and have written about the sort of phenomenon of wokeness, new contemporary elite progressive ideology, which is, I think, what we're talking about today.
Yeah. And Gabe?
I'm Gabriel Rossman. I'm a professor of sociology at UCLA, and I study diffusion of innovation, which is basically how ideas and behaviors spread, as well as immoral economic transactions.
Great. So I wanted to have you guys on because, wokeness as a political issue is something that I've thought a lot about, and it's something that you guys have thought a lot about as a policy issue. And from the direction of people concerned or at least skeptical or at least neutral towards wokeness. I think people who are pro-wokeness have thought about policy for a long time. But I think the people who've thought about it as a policy question from the other direction, it's a very, very small world. I think whether we're talking about academia or whether we're talking about journalism or we're talking about, talk show hosts or whatever, or Twitter personalities, there are just very, very few people thinking along these terms and thinking about it as a policy issue. So this is one of the reasons, I been talking to you guys, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you guys on. And I wrote, of course, an article that got a lot of attention called "Woke Institutions is Just Civil Rights Law." And then City Journal ran a few articles about wokeness as a woke capital as a phenomenon, or just wokeness more generally. And you guys both had an article, each in that piece, citing my article and taking issue with it or building on it. So we can start with Gabe. Your article is called "Why Woke Organizations All Sound the Same." Can you just sort of give us the overview of that and how the sociological research informs your view on this question?
Sure. So some of it is based on the sociological literature, specifically on diversity management, although Charles does a better job and more thorough job of reviewing that literature. But mostly, I was looking at the theory that sociologists use to explain business fads in general, which is neo-institutionalism. And neo-institutionalism has a couple of premises. One is the idea that legitimacy with the environment is very important to organizations, that having other actors within the organization's environment think of this this organization as basically a legitimate organization, an organization that's basically one of the good guys who's respectable, can be very important. It improves your access to credit. It makes you less likely to face hostile regulation. If you get sued, you'll have a better reputation to weather that litigation. There's all sorts of ways that reputation can benefit organizations. And then crucially, it assumes that doing the right things, doing the things that everybody accepts as that's just the way it's done, help give an organization legitimacy. So organizations derive legitimacy from what one of the earliest articles in this calls myth and ritual. And, it compares it pretty explicitly to, magic in Stone Age cultures. Now, more specifically than that, there's been some arguments about what types of stakeholders organizations are trying to take their cues from. And we refer to these as isomorphisms, right? The idea of same shape. And the big three are coercive, normative, and mimetic. Coercive isomorphism is the idea that organizations that can coerce you will shape the behavior of the focal organization. The most obvious one is the regulatory state, although your supply chain can be just as important. So one example would be if Fortune 500 companies demand racially coded billable hours from their law firms, then big law firms are going to provide racially coded billable hours. It's a supply chain thing of the customer's always right. And that's a little bit weird and creepy, and it has to do with civil rights type stuff. But in theory, it's no different from if McDonald's says that they want 92% lean beef, that every slaughterhouse in America is going to make sure that they ship 92% lean beef. That if the customer sets the standards, then the suppliers will meet those standards. So that's coercive isomorphism. And I think your essay on wokeness is just civil rights law would fit pretty neatly within that coercive isomorphism, because you're effectively talking about the regulatory environment and the legal environment, which would be aspects of that. But in addition to that, and when you said taking issue or whatever. I think more building upon is a better way to put it. In addition to the legal environment as a coercive thing on the organization, there's also normative and mimetic. Normative is the expectations of skilled professionals. Typically, we think of it as you hire some accountant, the accountant comes into your company and they look at your books and they say, that's not how I learned to do it at Harvard Business School. This is all wrong. We've got to redo your books in accordance with this best practices that I learned at Harvard Business School. So you can apply that to this sort of thing where you hire some HR person and the HR person says, well, that's not how we learned it wherever. Right, I was just at this workshop where we learned that the appropriate way to do HR is to have privilege walks, and so now we've got to have privilege walks, and we got to have people talking about white supremacy and all this sort of thing at our organization. So the expectations of skilled professionals, and in particular, legal and HR professionals, could be driving a lot of wokeness. But just beyond that, one of the patterns you've seen, if you've observed these things, is that it's people who, it's not necessarily their job description before wokeness, but are nonetheless skilled professionals, increasingly have the expectation that major organizations should reflect their woke values on these sorts of things. And so there's been numerous cases in tech where tech workers have effectively threatened to go on strike if the organization, Google or Apple or whatever. Google's probably the worst about this.
Yeah, Chappelle walkout. You had the Pentagon.
Yeah, exactly. The Chappelle walkout at Netflix, that sort of thing, where you have that's not the HR people at Netflix threatening to do that, or the gender sensitivity people at Netflix threatening to do that. That's people who produce shows for Netflix, right? These are people who it's not in their job description to be part of wokeness, but it's an important value that they presumably sincerely hold. And this seems to be a relatively new phenomenon. It wasn't part of the original formulation, but I think it's very clear that employee activism is a key issue here. And one way that it could kind of synthesize with what you were pointing out about civil rights law is that it lets the woke people within firms, the woke employees within firms, hit above their weight.
Yeah,
that,
of course.
If I have a grievance and I say, let's say I go to UCLA and I say, I think it's annoying that they're asking me to declare my pronouns. Like, that's just some old middle-aged white guy with an opinion being cantankerous. Yeah. But if somebody says, oh, I'm genderqueer and my professor won't let me declare my pronouns, the HR office has to think, could this person sue us? Right. So there's a sort of asymmetry that even if the and this is where I think you're right about, just civil rights law, but I think there has to be a demand from some constituency. And I think the main constituency is the employees. But what makes the woke constituency of the employees hit above their weight would be what you were talking about, civil rights law. And the last issue is mimetic isomorphism, which is the idea of there's an industry standard, there's a best practice, let's imitate what the leading companies are doing. And, once a practice becomes well established enough, it's simply like, well, this is the thing you do. All companies do this. Of course, we're going to do this because all other companies do this, or maybe the market leaders do this, or maybe, maybe you have your little ma and pa think tank, but you look around and you see all the other think tanks are making the junior scholars do elephant walks as part of their induction. And so you're going to do an elephant walk as part of your induction because, that's now a best practice in the industry. And even if you're going to think about it for a minute, you're like, this is completely ridiculous. You think, well, it's a best practice in the industry.
That's a legal standard now. The best practices is a defense against civil rights violations, right?
Yeah. So these things all cross-pollinate, right? Where when you have legal standards for best practices, that's effectively coercive isomorphism latching on to mimetic isomorphism and saying it's not just mimetic isomorphism, it's now the law.
Yeah. And so normative. So normative is the employees,
employee expectations,
and mimetic is just sort of we have this thing I've seen it in political science. I don't know if it comes from sociology or it comes from philosophy or where it comes from. It's called logic of appropriateness. Have you heard that term before?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so maybe it's a political science thing. I don't know, but they're basically institutions can operate on a logic of consequence. So this is like a firm trying to maximize, value or whatever. It could be a bureaucracy trying to whatever save lives or whatever. And then you have logic of appropriateness, which is just basically we do this thing because we're this kind of institution. So if you look at things like how militaries are organized, how health, departments are organized across the world, they tend to resemble each other a lot more than you would expect. Like, you look at these, the military and how it's set up in China versus the US, and maybe there's good reasons for it, but it seems way too close to be just, this is the way things are done. It's just basically people adopt, if this is a military, this is what you have, right? You have a Navy, you're divided by Navy, Army, whatever. So yeah, this is, and this is, but it's interesting. We go back to when you said the normative part about the white man not being able to punch above his weight because of the concerns of civil rights law. It's very,
well, it's not just that, right? I mean, in theory, and there's some debate about this, but in theory, they might have to take me seriously if I were to say, look, the privilege walk made me like wear the dunce cap because I had 5 points of privilege and only 1 point of anti-privilege or whatever. Yeah. In theory, they might have to take that seriously because in theory, a lot of these laws are, in fact, most of these laws are written facially neutrally. So in theory, I might have a grievance there. But if my grievance is not, this discriminates me because I'm a member of a particular class, but just I find this annoying,
yes,
then that has no grievance. So like, it's not about, so like, let's say that Glenn Lowry were to file a complaint with Brown University saying, I'm annoyed at this statement you made at the Floyd thing, which he did. Yeah. That doesn't carry any weight because he's not saying you discriminated against me as a black man. Yeah. He's saying, I just consider this to be unscholarly.
Yeah.
Right. And
the libs are the real racist. And then it takes on a whole new dimension. Then maybe that will get their attention if they say
this. There could be ways to frame that. Right. So if he had framed it not in terms of like, this is just unscholarly, it's undignified, it's unprofessional, it's against academic freedom, blah, 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 which is more or less how I recall his statement. But if he were to say something along the lines of this sets expectations that, indirectly affect the pipeline for minority scholars and create a hostile environment for minority scholars. Like you said, libs are the real racist thing. Then, in theory, that would have meant that the HR office would have had to pay attention, saying, look, if we end up firing him, he'll have grounds for wrongful termination or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about, Charles, can you talk about your piece?
Yeah, and my piece is in many regards, it's sort of historicization of the concepts that Gabriel just talked about. And, in it, I sort of, A, try to tell a historical story related to distinct from the one that you, Richard, have told. And then B, I sort of try to answer with that historical story a question, which is basically like, corporations are doing these crazy things, and particularly these sort of counter-interest things, because of wokeness. Why is that? So, the story that I tell to sort of gloss is like, the CRA, the Civil Rights Act, creates this new large complex bureaucracy with very heavy enforcement, very aggressive standards for how it wants businesses to comply, but also not a lot of clarity on what actually complying with CRA looks like. And what this does is create this like paradigm in the business world of what I can label compliance, where like the norms for race conscious policy are very much oriented towards how do we avoid pissing off the EEOC? How do we avoid upsetting the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, the two major regulators? How do we avoid upsetting the DOJ? How do we avoid complaints? And this is, this is a great example of the sort of most raw form, of course, of isomorphism, and this is the standard that predominates through the late 1960s, the early 1970s, is like basically American firms are implementing quotas, they are creating diversity offices or diversity in hiring offices because they're worried about what the federal government will do. That's their justification. That's so the course of isomorphism story on its own, and it says that to return to the point, the logical to use your language, there's a logical consequences there. It's like, why do we do this? Because that is, if we don't do this, we will run afoul of the government regulators. The sort of key turn in the story, this is drawn from the institutional literature, neo-institutionalist literature on this stuff. The key turn in the story comes in 1980, because as sort of today, although today is distinct, there's really a bipartisan consensus in Washington that the post-CRA regime is good, it's cool, quotas are great, we love all that. Americans hate it. Like universally in polls, Americans are not on board with this stuff. One of the ways that Ronald Reagan rides to power in 1980 is he says, Americans hate this stuff, I'm not going to do it when I'm president. That doesn't totally happen, but he sort of like puts his foot on the gas a little bit. He puts Clarence Thomas takes over at EEOC. The DOJ gets less into like going after disparate impact. There are a couple of other changes that he makes. And if it's sort of a pure logic of consequences story, then you would expect businesses to ratchet back their level of compliance. But instead what happens is the businesses go, no, we love diversity, we love race conscious policy, it's the best thing ever, we're going to do more and more and more of it. And they transition to this other logical rational justification, which I talk about as the business case for diversity. This becomes sort of the norm in the late 80s and early 90s, which is like basically, in order to compete in the 21st century, in the late 20th and early 21st century diverse economy, we need to diversify and be inclusive and bring everybody in. And then the piece, I sort of like review some of the literature on this, and I go like, in its very strongest form, diversity is like a minor contributor to the bottom line. Like it doesn't hurt, it doesn't help, it's sort of net neutral, but it certainly does not give you the sort of return on investment where it's worth the billions of dollars that firms now spend on this stuff and stimulus stuff. And so what I say is like, look, to go back to the neo-institutionalist logic, I think what has happened here is what the neo-institutionalists would call institutionalization, where no longer are firms doing this because there's a concern with a rational end. Rather, what firms are doing is seeking to they're following logic of appearances. They're doing what they're doing because it is what is done, and then justifications are all post hoc. And there's we can talk about the reasons why this persists, even if you sort of ratchet back pressure. But the sort of my key takeaway is like this explains a lot about why this stuff has gotten so extreme, why it becomes impossible for corporations to say no to any of this stuff, because there's no sort of like there's a limiting principle which grounds it. There's no reference to anything but itself, i.e., if we all agree that race conscious policy is good, and so more race conscious policy is better, and any rational relationship to reality goes out the window. So that's sort of the thrust of the article is documenting how we have corporate wokeness, to use Gabriel's language, has moved from being purely a story about coercive isomorphism to being a story about coercive isomorphism and mimetic isomorphism and normative isomorphism and all of those pressures, and how that explains why we've had this crazy runaway effect over the past 20, 30 years.
So I guess like it's interesting to think about how this sort of builds on and how it sort of responds to my article. So I think a naive reading of my article is basically, I don't think this is a correct reading, but you could say this is sort of the naive pure version, is that the government has its boot on the neck of corporate America. Yeah, that's the naive version of my article. And you're for contrast's sake, taken to its logical extreme, is what you're saying is if the government, and this sort of happened in the 1980s with Reagan, but not totally, if the government just stops doing this stuff, what's driving it? It's the HR departments, it's the media who is sort of, it's just the normative ideas they've internalized. What's keeping it going at that point?
Well, I don't sort of delve into the different actors that much. The sort of core answer is that this set of ideas as being just sort of like good and desirable has been broadly accepted. So the sort of pressure of institutionalization will keep driving it. I do think that there are a set of actors, an ever-growing set of actors who have self-interest in perpetuating this stuff. Like if you are a diversity professional in the rapidly ascending diversity interest, you want to convince people that diversity is really, really, really important. The same thing goes for administrators who are responsible for the stuff. There's also, I think, this cycle, this normative cycle that is under discussed, where compliance with corporate culture drives people who are entering the workforce, i.e. college students, to sort of shift left, And that in turn creates more left-leaning college students who then enter the workforce and, as Gabriel alluded to, become the activists who push the culture left. So there's a feedback loop that's important there too. I mean, I think that there are a whole bunch of different actors, all of whom are like immersed in this essential logic. The logic comes from this accident of history, but now it's everywhere and it sort of keeps pushing itself in.
Yeah. Well, what about, I mean, the premise, the idea that Reagan did actually scale back? How much was it? Like, do we have numbers? I've been meaning to look this up, but do we have numbers on the number of EEOC filings or whatever that, what was the trend during the Reagan administration?
So my understanding, so the best article on this is Dobbin Sutton's 1998. I believe it was from it was from ASQ, Administrative Science Quarterly, or was it AJS?
What's the year? Dave Dobbin.
1998. Dobbin Sutton, AJS. So Dobbin Sutton, American Journal of Sociology, 1998, and this is this article that shows that even after even while the Reagan administration took its foot off the gas, you still saw it basically the friction had been overcome and there was now inertia. And they attribute it to basically HR and legal.
Yeah.
That at this point there were internal constituencies within firms that push for expansion of these kinds of programs. And to the best of my recollection, I don't remember if I read this in Dobbin Sutton or something else, but to the best of my recollection, the Reagan administration's priorities under Clarence Thomas were basically to respond to overt discrimination, but not to look for disparities.
Yeah. So I can talk less about numbers, but more about history. Thomas, when he's in charge of the EEOC, explicitly says the goal of the EEOC has been these big systematic prosecutions based on sort of grand theories of disparate impact. We're not going to do that. We're going to focus on specific cases. The other big example is, again, in William Bradford Reynolds, who Reagan appoints to run the Office of Civil Rights at DOJ. And Reynolds comes out and says, we are in favor of colorblindness. We are in favor of we are against quotas. We think that these are bad things. There is sort of a more complicated institutional history of the push. So like Congress fights back against Reagan. There's entrenched bureaucracy. The Reagan Department of Labor is actually super woke. We wouldn't use that language then, but they're importantly progressive in a variety of ways. So it's not a uniform thing. But like I think it matters that the message coming out of the Reagan administration is we're not interested in doing this stuff anymore. And so that signaling is pretty unambiguous, which leads me to believe that, again, you would expect at least a marginal shift from businesses away from this stuff. And instead, the signal for businesses is, no, we want more of this stuff. Like this is, Reagan finishes his time in office in 1989. The 1990s is the great, the dawn of diversity research, the dawn of diversity consulting. None of that stuff goes away.
But you do have, let's think about it. Because the 1991, you get the Civil Rights Act of 1991. So the legal environment becomes much more woke, to use the term. You get
and in particular, my understanding is that it took what had been case law and made it statutory law. In part because some of the case law was reversed, and then they said, let's go back to the old, more woke.
Exactly. So there was there was even a movement towards a more conservative direction in the courts, and then the 19, bipartisan, both parties, overwhelmingly both parties. I looked it up the other day. I think something like 6 Republican senators voted against it. And besides that, everyone voted for it. But if you just want, how would you know whether culture was downstream from law? And 1980s, right? And it's confounded because the country voted for Reagan in 48 or 49 states in 1984. So the fact that Reagan was in office tells you something about the culture. But at the same time, maybe you could say this stuff that had downstream effect. If you look at the 1980s movies, I mean, they're very non-woke. I think less woke than probably any other decade since the 1960s. Maybe it was a conservative success story. Bought us 10 years of non-woke culture. Is that plausible to either of you?
Yeah, I don't know. It's funny because in some ways I am a sociologist of culture, but I don't really think so much about wasn't it Moynihan who said conservatives want culture to affect the state, but liberals, something like that.
Well, I think the quote is, I don't know if it's Moynihan, but the famous quote is I actually was in the David Brooks article in the Atlantic, which I just saw. It's like the insight of conservatives is culture matters more than politics. The insight of liberals is that politics can influence the culture, right?
Yeah.
So that would be a case of that. If you want to tie Clarence Thomas at the EEOC and the Reagan DOJ to the 1980s movies, right? Which is hard to do, but I don't know.
The way I was thinking about it is you had Constantine in 312.
Yeah.
And you had a few generations of that. And then you have Julian the Apostate and nothing happens. And then after Julian the Apostate, Christianity just keeps on chugging.
Right.
I would say two things. The first thing I would say is I think, the relationship between mass culture and this stuff is often pretty tenuous. The 1990s are a highly politically incorrect decade, right? Bill Clinton, who's the woman who
Lewinsky.
Who Bill Clinton tries to appoint at DOJ, the first public dispute over critical race theory.
Lonnie Guinier?
Yes, Lenny Guinier. Sorry, for context, Bill Clinton.
I thought you were going to talk about Lewinsky jokes, late night comics, but that's
I thought you were also going to talk about the nanny problems, where he had 3 attorney generals who all had under the table nannies, and
neither that. No. So the public's first major encounter with critical race theory as a concept is when Bill Clinton tries to appoint a professor named Lonnie Guinier position at DOJ. I think it's the Office of Civil Rights, and there's mass outcry because people come upon her academic writing and they go, "What is this insanity?" And he's forced to withdraw it. America is a very conservative country in the 1980s and 1990s. Why? You can have a dispute about what that is, but I think even the culture has ebbed and flowed. I think that the mass culture has ebbed and flowed, but I think that sort of the business priorities have continued more or less in one directionally since the 1960s. They haven't gotten less woke over time.
I guess I'm looking at the mass culture because it's sort of a very, very downstream, but the business culture, you're right. It does have I think I was going to say, do we know that the 1980s are worse? Yeah, I've seen the charts and
one of the things that I think is relevant here is that, the culture can ebb and flow and be more conservative or more liberal, whereas, certain norms become entrenched. This is part of sort of the core of my argument is at no point do we ever really challenge the idea. Do executives and the people who are charged with doing this within the administrative bureaucracy ever challenge the idea that corporations should be spending a lot of time counting how many black people they employ, how many white people they employ, that they should be spending a lot of time not just doing the administrative compliance things, but also subjecting people to diversity seminars, to talking about how to be more inclusive, to talking about the 21st century advantage. One of the anecdotes that I relate in the piece is, so there's this key moment in the late 1980s, just before the end of the Reagan administration, the Reagan Department of Labor puts out this report called Workforce 2000, in which they say, okay, by the year 2000, only 30% of people entering the workforce will be white men. And the lesson that everyone takes away from this is that by the year 2000, the workforce is going to be a majority minority. We have to dramatically shift everything. And because
I don't think it was even 30% entering. I thought it was 30% of the marginal entrants to account for the growth.
Yes. It's 30% of net entrants are white men. Right. The statistic gets started. My point though is corporations, simultaneously, America is very conservative in the 80s and 90s, and corporations are obsessed with race. They're obsessed with all the things that they're obsessed with today. I was talking to a friend earlier today. He made the point that there are a lot of continuities between the political correctness disputes of the 1990s and the wokeness disputes of today. But I think, in both cases, there were just this presumption of corporations should be in the race consciousness game that went totally unchallenged within the boardroom and within the administrative bureaucracies that had sprung up, and that were profiting off of its continued existence.
Was that true? I mean, I'm trying to remember. I mean, unlike, I'm going to pull cohort privilege on you, in that I can remember the 90s, and I feel like the stereotype of political correctness was that it was mostly an academic thing. In the 90s. And, I like a lot of people, I got a copy of like the political correctness dictionary and stuff like that. And like half the book was quotes from this one crazy Afrocentrist professor at CUNY named Leonard Jeffries. But like it seemed like it was mostly academics who were being made fun of. It wasn't nearly as much.
Yeah, so my claim is not that boardroom execs were politically correct. They weren't necessarily. My claim is that race consciousness was always on the table in the boardroom. That if you go read the Harvard Business Review from the 1990s, they're talking about how you can manage diversity. That was like the hip trend.
There were cases at the time of organizations trying to implement diversity training or workshops or that sort of thing, and it going badly and it backfiring. My understanding, and I'm not like a huge expert on this, is that the Texaco case was in part, it was kind of like the Papa John's thing, where it was like a diversity effort gone wrong that like wildly backfired, where in the course of a diversity exercise, the executive said things that were really racist, trying to participate in the diversity exercise, and then that got taken as straightforwardly racist, and they end up losing a lot of money over it.
Yeah, it was like $135 million settlement. I mean, so
yeah, and my understanding is like the smoking gun evidence was that they referred to workers of different races as different colors of jelly beans, but apparently they'd gotten that metaphor directly from the diversity trainer they met like 2 days earlier.
Right. So basically, I mean, I guess so there was this race consciousness, and it could backfire, but it wasn't that the discrimination wasn't that they were, trying to, there wasn't against whites. It was too insensitive towards blacks, right? And so it was sort of like a, I think that, what the courts were doing, and I think the media plays a big role here, is they're sending a message, basically, you have to be very, very careful. Right. You don't do it with a smile on your face, or you don't do it with a smirk. Right. You take it to, you know who the protected groups are. You just tread very carefully. And so, yeah, the 1990s, there was a lot of big cases like this. It seems like, people, I mean, just culturally, like if you say, like the phrase like New York Times, who is white? Like if you mentioned someone was white, like just out of context, it would have been very, without like a really, really good reason for it. It was just seen as a very, very strange thing. I mean, people just thought completely differently. And then in the 2000s, it's not that different. I mean, in the 2000s. I mean, I think the red state, blue state divide, like really the first time people really talk about that is 2004, the 2000 election. You have that Simpsons clip that I showed the other day where the aliens come to Earth and they take, it was still basically that. That was Clinton and Dole, where they, take over their bodies, and the joke is they're drones, they're indistinguishable. In 2000s, it was pretty much the same thing. I think 9/11, you get red state, blue state.
Iyengar's work seems to trace the rise of the rise of hyperpolarization and negative partisanship is distinct from the Great Awakening. And Shanto Iyengar at Stanford has done the best work on this. And to the best of my recollection, he basically traces it to the late 90s. And he doesn't trace it to a particular event, but if you had to put an event on it, the Clinton impeachment over the Lewinsky scandal is as good as anything. That's roughly the time that you start seeing hyper-negative partisanship.
Yeah.
And that roughly predates the Great Awakening by almost 15 years.
Right.
Let me maybe offer sort of an illustrative example, which is so if you sort of follow this stuff, there's your listeners may be familiar with the acronym DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and if they're really hip to it, they know that what you do now is you talk about DEIBJ, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice.
Is this? It's at Berkeley. I don't know how far it's gone. Yeah, it'll be everywhere. It'll be everywhere before long, I'm sure.
If you go Google it, you can. I saw somebody use it on LinkedIn yesterday. But the continuing addition of letters to that acronym begins with just diversity practice in the 1990s, right? It starts with like the basic premise of it is important that our country be conscious of the racial composition and that we need to take active steps in order to ensure that we are diverse, that we have diversity. That's essential. And then we say, okay, but it's not actually just that. We also need to care about inclusion because just having people learn isn't enough. And then you add to that equity, which is like not just equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. And then you add to that belonging, which is sort of more cultural. And you add to that the concept of justice, which is social. These are accumulated over time. If you go read accounts from diversity professionals, they'll say this is the understanding of the field is expanded over time. And the way that what I see happening there is like there's a basic premise that was written in 30, 40 years ago, which is like it matters the racial composition of your firm matters, and ensuring that your firm falls over a certain racial composition matters. And everything else is propagated outwards from there in this sort of like, because you agree with this, you also have to agree with all of Ibram Kendi's conclusions. And that logic has run away on its own over and above whether the public believes that, and certainly whether the guys who are in the White House believe that. The people, the institutional structure of business, just it is written into the DNA of that thing at this point.
Yeah. Is it? I mean, is one solution to this? So it's too naive to expect that Reagan comes along or any conservative administration comes along and things change overnight. And maybe corporations, what they are is, what they are, they're stuck with what they are, right? Is it the hope could be if someone wants to, and maybe we should shift a little bit towards, prospects for fighting wokeness and, what could work if anything. The idea is you would basically you'd write off whatever the Fortune 500 companies today, but there's massive turnover in what the Fortune 500 companies are, right? There's turnover in one thing people used to say about Silicon Valley was that they basically had no HR departments, and they've been gone after for that, and there was always sort of a threat of there's a legal aspect to this threat, right? But the idea is you would change the law, and then you would wait for corporate turnover. You would let the market be dynamic, and then maybe you'd have to wait 20, 30 years, and then it's a new generation that did not have to think this much about compliance. They have no established HR bureaucracy. Is that perhaps the best that the anti-wokes can hope for?
This seems like the Exodus theory of cultural change, right? You have the generation in the wilderness that never saw.
For corporations, for institutions, right? Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm skeptical of that because you kind of had that with tech. We already had this complete transformation of industry where you had these old legacy firms that many of which
but I'm saying you have to change the law. You have to change the law first because because eventually you're going to run into the same. Yeah,
and that's what happened in tech, right? Tech used to have this kind of vaguely libertarian culture, and totally indifferent to basically kind of an old-fashioned color blindness, and they don't really care that it turns out that almost everybody's a white or Asian man in their companies mentality. And that's completely changed over the last 10 years. With the Great Awakening, tech has, somebody like DeMoore used to be typical of tech.
Yeah.
And now he's, an outlier who has to be purged. No, I understand what you're saying, that you'd have to have that kind of scale of industrial transformation during a different legal environment.
Exactly.
And we don't know exactly what's going on, but at some point Google hired all these HR people and things like that. And some of that may just be because you're hiring the good computer programmers. They're all 22 years old and straight out of MIT and have blue hair and 5 genders. And so they all come into your organization and they say, it's important to us that we have this. And if you don't do this, we're going to go on strike and kill the DoD Google Cloud contract and do this and that. But part of it could be because, Google obviously faces a lot of regulatory threat as a monopolist. And so if any company needs legitimacy, it's going to be, the FANG companies, especially ones like Google, where they really do have, you don't even need to look back that far. You don't need to look back to AT&T being broken up or US Steel being broken up or something. You can just look at the Microsoft Netscape suit. Google has done probably dozens of things more egregious than giving Internet Explorer away free with Windows. And so it's very important to them to be able to escape regulatory scrutiny. And to the extent that, the state prefers this, then they're going to adopt this. And like you're saying, now Google's going to have that forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's a good question.
You got to wait for Coinbase to become Google, but Coinbase will face the same pressures.
Yeah. So let's imagine that Reagan had become, God Emperor Lich King Reagan, who, reigned on his throne of skulls for 3 decades.
Yeah.
And that was enough time to, in the 1991 Civil Rights Act never passed. And you had basically a Thomas approach to civil rights enforcement for an entire generation. And during that time, you got Google. It's entirely possible that Google would still have the kind of Silicon Valley culture that you see described in early Neil Stephenson novels.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think like heterogeneity is important here, right? Like we focus a lot on the big firms. Fortune 500 matters a lot in terms of impact, but the way that I think about this is like very tactically, which is ultimately the goal should be you identify the levers you can actually pull. Like people are critical of wokeness can't control Hollywood. They can't affect the culture, but they can totally control what goes in front of the Supreme Court. They can totally control state legislatures. And then B, you say you want to make it more costly to engage in the behaviors that you don't like, and you want to make it less costly to engage in the behaviors that you do like. So like, when you talk about making it more costly to engage in behaviors that you don't like, the Trump administration did exactly one good thing on this issue, right? They issued the anti-DEI training EO in the waning days of the administration. Right. It was really successful. There were lots of
they were crying on Twitter. It hurt their pocketbook.
Yeah, I'm actually not convinced that was a good idea, because by doing I mean, it's the kind of thing that might have been a good idea if he did it on day one of a 2-term administration. Yeah. But by doing it, as practically a lame duck, you're effectively just asserting that negative partisanship will. I mean, there was this pattern, particularly with Trump, where anytime Trump did something, even if liberals had previously opposed it, they said if Trump is for it, we're against it. Right. So you saw immigration became much more popular.
But Trump also set an example for the states now that they're doing it at the state level too. So it has a
and much like the Mexico City policy or other executive orders that get reversed and then re-reversed when the White House reaches power, it reduces the certainty for government trainers. It makes it more costly to be in that business, and so it makes it more unpleasant in the long run. That's the goal.
Regulatory uncertainty, it's not a bug, but a feature.
It's right. So you, Gabriel, and I like to talk about Mark Kleiman, the late Mark Kleiman, the political scientist and theorist of, among other things, drug markets. Mark Kleiman liked to say the goal of drug policy is to create inefficient markets for drugs. That like when you have a substance that you don't like, you want to make the market as inefficient as possible so that there will be less of it. And regulators can make it very unpleasant. The other thing you do is try to make it much easier. So you make it harder for people to run these trainings. You can try to bring lawsuits. We talked before the podcast about this Woke Act in Florida that just came out, where having these trainings introduced a hostile work environment. Like the plain text of the CRA, which of course has not been enforced for 40 years, very clearly prohibits lots of things that corporations are now doing. The right is not good at a lot of things in American culture, but we're actually good at suing, and we control a lot of the courts and will for some time.
Is the right good at suing? I mean,
yeah.
This is a war of attrition. Who can file the most lawsuits? Do you think the right's going to win that battle?
Yes, I think I think the right at present has a better legal infrastructure. I think the right. So the case at which I am essentially optimistic is the Harvard case, which I think will prove a major.
I think the federal judge. I mean, the judges. Yes, if you get to the judiciary, you punch way above. The right punches way above its weight compared to any other institutions. Once I was working for some organization, and they were looking at affirmative action stuff, and they had me just look at something, and I remember reading some plain statute of Supreme Court case where it just plainly says you cannot just have a carve out for one race, say a scholarship at some university. And basically I was like, oh, look, why don't you just go, sue for that? And I feel like the kind of people looking for racism against blacks, looking for sexism against women, and the kind of the number of competent lawyers who want to sue because of anti-white male discrimination, I think there's orders of magnitude difference. I don't think that's anywhere close.
Yeah. So I think you are right that the left is better at finding test cases, right? The success of same-sex marriage.
I just want to total up everyone who works for ACLU, everyone who works up for the NAACP.
I think that right. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund has been extremely successful. I think the right is figuring out how, much as the left is copying certain legal infrastructure from the right slowly but steadily, the right is figuring out how to do this. The sort of early successful example of this is Heller v. District, right? Is the two cases. Right. And what's crazy about Heller v. District is that the right reads right out of the left.
Explain. Our audience are not full of scholars.
Yeah, sorry. So there are two major cases in which conservative legal activists find ways for the Supreme Court to establish the right to keep and bear arms as not just a right that pertains to militia, but an individual right. There's the federal case Heller v. District, and then McDonald v. Chicago, which incorporates the right against the state. The clever thing about Heller v. District is that the guys who ran the case, they found this like ideal lineup of like the best possible plaintiffs. The named plaintiff Heller is, if I remember this correctly, a gay resident of D.C. who used his gun to defend himself against being assaulted by bigots. Like, you can't pick a better defendant than that.
White
the
bigots?
same thing was, I think so, yes.
Okay, perfect. You needed that.
The same thing is true in all the cake baking cases. I don't know why they keep going after this like poor innocent cake baker, but they do, and he's a great victim.
Right. That's the left. That's the left choose. That's the left choosing. I mean, the right.
Right. Yeah. Well, who the money gets followed. My point is, I think we're getting. I think you're right that historically the left has been better at this. I think we're getting better at it, and more importantly, we have a much more sympathetic ear. The Harvard case is the work essentially of one guy, Ed Blum, who has been litigating this stuff for decades. And I think he's got a real chance of winning because he knows his audience, he knows how to win, and he's put together a compelling story. I talked to somebody the other day. This is the last point I'll make that's adjacent to this. What matters is always framing the story in terms of things that people cannot disagree with. The left has been successful in the past 5 years in saying, how can you not be an anti-racist? Everyone is against racism, so you must be anti-racist if you agree with this. And the sort of fight against CRT is really the mobilization of people being pro-parents. Who is anti-parent? And if you're pro-parent, then you have to say that CRT is bad. And you have to be on our side in this fight. And I think that's sort of tactical choice we're getting better at. I think the right is there are lots of ways in which the right has been bad at this historically, but basically those are the cases that you then figure out how can you apply pressure to people in races? How do you make it more costly to do this stuff?
Yeah. The Rufo model. I mean, the Rufo model is just so interesting because it's just one guy going on one show, one guy in his Twitter account, and executive order. Trump could have done this day one. I mean, he could have done it day one. He could have done, if Chris Rufo had focused on affirmative action. So for the audience that doesn't know, this is all covered in my article on woke institutions. The entire affirmative action regime in the private sector has a legal underpinning of executive orders, which force affirmative action on every single government contractor. And that's pretty much huge, and their subcontractors, which is a huge above a certain limit of government contractors.
And I think we should clarify, when you say government contractor, people think Lockheed and that's it.
No,
right. It's the whole economy.
Yeah,
everybody sells something.
I think it's $50,000. You have to do $50,000 in business. So no matter if you're a $10 billion company and you do $50,000 in business, right? And by the way, and then you also have the way affirmative action is interpreted for the federal government, and putting aside like the EEOC and Department of Education and all those other things that the federal the executive branch, the top of the executive branch controls, right? Just executive order, right? The entire affirmative action regime is executive order, literally the easiest thing in politics to change. It's just
originally.
I mean, some of that is now statutory law with the Civil Rights Act of 1991.
But much of it is not.
Much of it is not.
Even when you talk about making things easier, from a political perspective, it can be hard to sort of undo a lot of this executive order work. But you can clarify or otherwise reduce reporting burdens. You can set policy at the level of the EEOC and the Office of Federal Contract Compliance programs. You can make it so that insofar as conservatives can control arms of government, you can make it so that firms like Coinbase, firms that do not want to go along to get along, do not have to worry about coercive isomorphism. You don't have to worry about regulatory pressure. You can say, we are open for this kind of business. That's the other half of the equation. Is you say, you can't necessarily pick winners. Just it'd be good if you could, but it's hard. But you can say we're going to make it hard for the people we don't like to thrive, and make it easy for people that we do like to thrive.
Yeah,
within the bounds of pre-existing law.
Yeah, I mean, one thing people still say to me is like, okay, you think it's all based on Civil Rights Act, so getting rid of the Civil Rights Act is hard. It's like, but there's not a lot of mass passion for the reporting requirements for corporations and how they count people, but by race, right? So I think this stuff is a lot.
We've had the reporting requirements for federal contractors since I think it's 1967, and
right.
So there's a big.
You can still.
There's a big difference between that and the thing that's really kind of exploded post-Floyd, where you have really aggressive malice, self-criticism style
Yeah.
diversity training. There's no executive order that requires that. And as Charles pointed out, there was for a few weeks between Trump giving the order and, being replaced by Joe Biden. There was an executive order banning that. But, that's something that's spread by another process. And it seems, and I think where you're right, you, Richard, is that it's spread because civil rights law is incredibly vague. Yeah. And, the basic way it works is it says if you have a disparity, there's kind of a presumption of guilt there. And then we'll see what the evidence is. And so companies want to create the legitimacy of saying, here's all these efforts to show that even though we have this disparity, there's no malice. And so they go to all these great lengths to do it. So that would require changing not just an executive order, which is relatively easy. And like you said, it can go like ping pong every time a new administration comes in. Yeah. But something much more about changing the case law and the actual statutory law, which would be harder.
But doable with the current composition of the courts, and I think the small things matter too. Let me give an example from a conversation.
But Charles, why haven't the court studied yet? So they seem to chicken out. They seem to punt every time. So I remember when it was, I think when they after Grutter, it was the next after Kennedy.
I mean, all the people
who replaced Kennedy. It was
Gorsuch. Are you talking about Bostock?
Well, forget Bostock for a second. But every time they get a new Supreme Court justice, I do the calculations based on who's voted against affirmative action in the past. And at some point, I said, okay, we've got 5. And I think that was that was even before that. That was when Kennedy had used to vote against affirmative action. So we had 5 for a decade that at some point when they were in the minority voted against affirmative action, right? And so we've had 5 to 10 years now of people who've on the record at one point or another being against affirmative action, and they've never tossed the thing out, or they've never really cut back on it at all. What is going on here? Because it seems different from guns, where the conservative movement has had success, and it seems different from the abortion stuff, where it seems like they are moving in the direction of chipping away at Roe v. Wade. But there's, I would say there's been no movement in the last 5-10 years as the courts have gotten more conservative on the civil rights stuff. And just why is that?
I'm not convinced there's been no movement. One example, so the one that people on the left will gnash their teeth and wail about is Shelby County, which pertains not to the civil rights state, but to the Voting Rights Act. But right, it's a good example of of the court seeking to rebut
the busing case in Seattle, right? They got rid of it. I just read the other day they're still doing busing in Minneapolis. I don't know why, but apparently it never goes away. But I remember there was a decision written by Roberts that based in Seattle that said no more school busing, but they still do it.
I mean, I am more optimistic about Harvard than some of my friends who are better pessimists about the court. Who like to joke that we have 2, maybe 3 conservatives on the Supreme Court right now. I'm more of an optimist than that. I think I could be proved wrong. It's hard to know, but I think that right. So Gabriel was talking about Grutter, the 2003 case, in which everyone thought that the sort of nominally conservative court was going to finally dump affirmative action. Said no.
Yeah, for our listeners, this was an affirmative action case sue against University of Michigan, and they basically upheld affirmative action. And Sandra Day O'Connor said, in 25 years we probably won't need it. And
well, but it was worse than that, because I increasingly think that Grutter was a strategic mistake in practical terms, in that. Prior to the Ward-Connerly ballot initiatives, a lot of states, the way that affirmative action college admissions often worked is that you would basically just say, you get the equivalent of an extra 100 SAT points. Yeah. It was just like a strict mathematical thing. You could write an Excel function, more or less. So the way it literally worked in the University of California is half the freshman class, was admitted on a weighted average of GPA and SAT. And then the other half was holistic admissions. And then a few years after 209 and the Regents' decision that preceded 209, the University of California said, "Oh, this sucks. Let's get around this by just going 100% holistic
What's
admissions."
209? Well, what are you talking? What's that number?
209 was the first Ward-Connerly ballot initiative. It banned affirmative action in the state of California. And then he took that as kind of a roadshow and got it passed in half a dozen other states that had ballot initiative process. So from 1996 to roughly 1999, Ward-Connerly who was a conservative activist in California and a member of the UC Board of Regents. He got affirmative action bans in public contracting and public university admissions banned in like half a dozen states. I think they were Washington, California, Michigan. I forget the others. Anyway, so in response, the state university system said, like, well, let's go to 100% holistic admissions. And that's what was litigated in the Grutter decision. And the Grutter decision affirmed that. And I honestly think, like, we were better off.
So the Grutter decision said you can't do the explicit thing, which is the point system, but it said you can do holistic admission. This was the problem.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. And I think it's more socially destructive to have an essay contest on racism than just quietly giving people an extra 100 points.
Right. And so this is the funny thing, because this is the common thing where the sort of the compromise at the court has always been you can't do straight up quotas, right? But you can use race, and that's the worst of all worlds, because if you did quotas, you could have an IQ test and just have quotas and just have the best people.
Yeah, and we wouldn't have had this radical transfer. I mean, so like Ramy and Ramey's The Rugrat Race says that the transformations in middle class parenting, where we've made middle class parenting incredibly time consuming, ultimately trace to the shift towards college admissions. And
Grutter was more destructive than I could have imagined.
Yeah, exactly. Like all these, it's not enough to, like, your kid goes to high school, they come home, they do their homework, and then you watch TV. It's, you got to drive them around to this lesson and this game and this, practice. Like that's kind of an upper class habitus that was originally developed by the Ivy League to keep out Jews in the 1920s, and then that spread to state university systems around 1998 as part of the shift to holistic admissions, as a backlash to the Connerly ballot initiatives. And I think it's not a fun way to raise children, right? I mean, to have this.
Right. It's expensive signaling when we used to have a cheaper signal, which is bad for everybody.
So what is preventing a conservative state government from passing a law saying all university admissions will just be a standardized exam?
Well, but I will tell you, so in California, with COVID, the University of California recently banned the SAT, and that kind of came out of a temporary. It's one of these many, like, here's something temporary for COVID, and then it becomes permanent. And we wanted it during COVID. We wanted it to be optional, and a judge said you can't make it optional because this has disparate impact on people who, for whatever reason, can't safely take the SAT or whatever. And then I believe it was the regents banned it against the faculty. If it was up to a vote of the faculty senate would have voted to keep it. And the faculty senate wrote a report saying, the SAT is pretty good, or maybe we should develop a new test. But, basically the faculty on net were in favor of some kind of testing, maybe even the SAT itself. But the regents, and I think it's fair to say under certain legal pressure, because of disparate impact concerns, got rid of it. I think... California is a left-wing state. We have a Democratic governor who appoints a Democratic board of regents to the state university system, but the legal environment isn't that different for conservative states. I mean, we're in the Ninth Circuit, but aside from that, it's not clear to me that the legal environment is that different for, say, the state of Texas.
So you think if the state of Texas got rid of, made everything, I mean, we're just fantasizing here because no conservative government is close to doing anything like this. But if the state of Texas went and then said, they're going to be open to disparate impact if they go and they say we're only going to do everything based on standardized tests, but they're in the Fifth Circuit, right? And that's, I think, a conservative circuit, and it would probably get upheld. It goes to
I think the Biden Department of Education would go after them, and I think they'd probably lose. I think that absolutely the state
Texas would lose or Biden would lose.
Biden would lose.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's just political.
I don't think there's a reason not to do it.
Yeah.
I think it would be broadly popular with voters.
This is a political failure.
Now, what actually happened in Texas when affirmative action was banned, I forget if it was a court case or legislature or whatever, but one way or another, explicit race norming, here's an extra 100 SAT points style affirmative action was banned in Texas in the 1990s, and they switched to the high school plan,
right,
where they said we're going to take the top 10% of each high school and let them into UT.
Well, here's the difficulty. Here, I guess, is the difficulty, right? Because you would end up the demographics of UT Austin would be white and Asian in a state that were probably plurality or majority of young people are Hispanic or Black, and so you'd have to deal with that reality, right? And you can't. And if you wanted to get around it by quotas, you can't do that either, right? So what are you stuck with? You're stuck with stupid stuff like the 10% high school.
Basically, the only thing that's legal is Grutter. Like basically, the only thing that's legal is like this. You can't say we're going to have.
You can wink at it.
Yeah, exactly. You can't say, I don't know what the demographics of Texas are, but let's say that young people in Texas are 50% Latino and 20% Black, 30% Anglo or whatever. You can't say we're going to have those, and then within that, it's just going to be SAT. Like that wouldn't be allowed.
Right, exactly. And you can't just have just SAT. But if you
also couldn't just do SAT. I think pretty much it's like whatever is forbidden, whatever's not forbidden is mandatory, right? I mean, in effect, Grutter is more or less required because everything else.
No, Grutter doesn't.
Grutter says the use of race or not. Or
Grutter says you can do this. Grutter says you can if you want to.
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying Grutter, the kind of Grutter standard of holistic admissions is more or less mandatory. Like it'd be very difficult to do anything.
If we agree with the premise that a conservative Supreme Court, this composition of the Supreme Court would say. They would say the quota thing is probably illegal. That they would also say the not shrugging your shoulders and saying, so what, we're just, whatever. The demographics are what they are. We're assuming that they won't uphold that. Now,
you can't imagine Robert saying that.
We don't even need him. I mean, this is the crazy thing about our system.
I think you can count to 5 on that.
What's that?
I think you can count to 5 on that. I think that they would. And
it's easier. I mean, the thing is, the politics affects the legal. So it's easy if you have a state legislator doing something, right, and then asking the court to uphold it. It's just much easier politically and legally too than them, creating a new system. Like saying, California, you have to do this, right? It's just very, it's just different. But yeah, I'm fascinated. And what I think is, I just contrast this civil rights stuff and affirmative action just with. When they just with other things that conservatives care about, so like abortion, like guns, there's like these standard laws that they pass when they do get into power, and there's just nothing like that on wokeness. And I don't think it's the political difficulty is that hard. I don't think this is hard to sell to a base or a red stage constituency by any means. I think you can take the hit from the media if you can do the abortion stuff. You can take the hit on getting rid of affirmative action at the state level or whatever. It's just the political will, the activism, and the sort of the expectation that politicians will do this stuff. It's not there yet.
I think it's also a certain amount of stickiness. So you alluded to Chris Rufo, my colleague, who's my colleague at the Manhattan Institute, actually. And I think a lot of what Chris did was, Chris did what all successful policy entrepreneurs do, which is that they identify something that's in the water, something that everyone sort of vaguely knows is going on, but nobody really talks about, and dramatically raised its salience. He was like, "Oh, hang on." There's this crazy stuff that's happening in all of our schools. You need to wake up and pay attention. Once people could coordinate around that, you see an immediate and dramatic shift on the part of politicians who recognize that there's a constituency here. There's always this problem of concentrated benefits, diffuse costs, concentrated constituencies, diffuse disinterest. As I said earlier, Americans consistently in polls, they hate quotas. They're against race-conscious policy, but they're not against it enough to actually do anything about it. If you raise the salience of the issue, if you say, this is what we're going to vote on, this is what parents are mad about, then if you build a constituency around it, as I think Chris has worked to do, as I think was successful on the margins in the Virginia gubernatorial race, as I think will be hugely beneficial for the GOP in 2022, I think you can activate that. You alluded to guns and abortion. Those are the two areas where there's successful activation, where there's a entrenched constituency. But making entrenched constituency is not just about will. It's mostly about policy salience. It's mostly about convincing people that this is an issue. And then stuff happens.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And I don't know. I think the politics are more complicated than we're letting on, because in principle, you do a poll and you say, do you think that race should be a thumb on the scale, or, hardly a factor at all, or whatever, right? Those types of questions, people would say, people tend to go somewhere between thumb on the scale and not a factor at all. But most people would probably disagree with something like, I think it should be the equivalent of 200 SAT points, which is more or less what the Harvard lawsuit and Tom Espenshade's work have shown. But on the other hand, if you were to say to people, what if there was a policy change that would take the University of Texas freshman class and move it from 5% Black and 30% Hispanic to 1% Black and 8% Hispanic? I think people would be horrified by that. Like, I don't think that would be politically sustainable, even if in principle people, and I'm honestly not even sure if people would be wrong to be horrified by that. Like, is that socially sustainable to have, huge disparities in the composition of the elite?
I think you can have that debate. I think it depends on how you frame it, but that's not the debate that we have right now. Like, if the political left was defending explicit quotas, that would be on the grounds referred to, on grounds of social comedy. I think that is at least a more honest position than the status quo, which has been precipitated by cases like Rudder, where we sort of have these like vague notions of diversity being good for its own sake.
It goes all the way back to Bakke. Right?
It goes all the way back to Bakke. That would at least be a preferable political status quo, having a fight about that as opposed to the fight that we're currently allegedly having.
Yeah, my view is, on what Gabe says is I think polarization is such a strong thing that a lot is actually sustainable at a state level. I think that there's sort of this dynamic where whatever you do in Texas, the more California hollers about it, that the easier sort of it becomes to maintain politically, and vice versa. And I think that if you look at something like you would have to do it first, right, before you get the demographics, right? So you'd have to rely on you do it, right, and then people they don't know the implications right away, and then there's 10% Hispanics, whatever in Texas, and then people have to go, and then they have to go do the policy thing again, and that's hard because there's a status quo bias. So I think actually a lot of things. Especially if a Republican state where Republicans reliably win elections. So I think there's a status quo bias. I think there's negative polarization. I think there's a lot that's working that's in a way expands sort of the scope of what is possible. Like the Voting Rights Act, I think, is a fascinating case because this was something that used to get passed, I think, unanimously in Congress. And if the Supreme Court had gutted it 30 years ago, I think Congress would have basically just overrode them and then just basically done something. And that didn't happen now because it's become a partisan issue. I think there's, I think conservatives are, when Reagan was thinking about getting rid of the executive order on affirmative action, there was a bipartisan backlash. That would not happen today, right? There's no way Trump wanted to get rid of affirmative action. Half the Republicans, even the Liz Cheney's and whoever's against Trump, 90% of even those people, I think, would be on board. And so, yeah, I think I disagree with Gabe. I think I think you're right that the implications could be uncomfortable, but the implications are sort of downstream from doing the policy today. And then I think a lot of things are sustainable once it becomes.
That would make it much harder to do it in the second state.
In the what?
Right. So, like, let's say that I don't know why we're going on for 20 minutes about this thought experiment, but with the utopian or dystopian.
Well, it's interesting. People who care about wokeness do care about sort of the political prospects.
Yeah. Although I think wokeness is qualitatively distinct from, like, I think it's possible to have a non-woke affirmative action system.
Sure.
I mean, the extreme case would be something like Malaysia, where the ethnic Malay minority says it's not fair to expect us to compete with these brilliant Chinese. Yeah. So we need
the majority. You said Malay minority. The majority.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Excuse me. The Malay majority says it's not fair to expect us to compete with these brilliant Hakkas. So we need to have this affirmative action system for us. So like it is. So that's about as unwoke as you could get. Anyway, but so let's say hypothetically.
I think in practice, though, I think what you find is a lot of the demographic composition of institutions does determine their politics. So if you have a lot of minorities and women especially if they concentrate in certain departments, that end in studies, I think that there's a pretty obvious downstream effect of that on the wider culture of the institution.
I think what I'd say in general about sort of conscious quota policy is that it can be managed well. When you talk about Southeast Asian examples, Singapore, Malaysia, it can be managed well. Also sort of in the post-Balkan states, but it can also go really badly. I think that the regime, the sort of regime ideals of the contemporary progressive left look much more like post-apartheid South Africa or many of the regimes across Latin America, where there is, I think, much more just sort of struggle between ethnic groups. The American solution historically to the reality of living in a multi-ethnic country has been colorblindness and universal citizenship. And we can say that may not work very well. I think Gabriel's probably right that people would be alarmed when the courts ban affirmative action and next year 90% of admits Yale and Harvard are Asian. That would prompt some result. But I think that they would be running up against a very powerful American norm, which is like, we believe in meritocracy regardless of race, creed, or color, and it will be at least.
I mean, have you lived?
I think Americans do believe that. I think the majority of Americans believe that.
Yeah, have you seen the recent polls on like abolishing standardized tests, which is I think a slight majority is in favor of?
Yeah, but that's because they don't believe the standardized tests.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem.
They're wrong about standardized tests.
They like the subjective standard of merit that everyone should live up.
Yeah, which in practice means that your parents paid for lacrosse lessons.
Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. I love these conversations because there is, the criticisms of wokeness and concern with wokeness is, this kind of discussions are a dime a dozen. And there's just such a market demand, I think, for conversations about actual policy and what's politically plausible and what can be done and what should be done. And so I appreciate having you guys on. Gabe, is there anything you want to plug or anything you're working on before we go?
Oh, just like nerdy academic stuff that will be 3 years before it gets through peer review.
Okay. And Charles, you work on a different schedule, so
I'm I don't know 10 years, so I do have to plug myself. Check out my work at City Journal. This is one of our main issue areas at the Manhattan Institute. I mentioned my colleague Chris Rufo, my colleague Heather McDonald. Our legal team is very interested in this topic. We're very into this topic, so check out all of their work. I'm on Twitter. I'm at Charles F. Lehman. You can follow me there. And also online in general.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys.
All right, good talking to you.
Thanks.